practices of self-care and spirituality sustain you through the trials and joys of life? And how do you nurture your soul?
Well, that is actually one of the practices of self-care I do is I sing. I love to sing. I have since I was a little kid. And that is one of the things that absolutely feeds my soul when I do it, which is not often enough. But in general, I would say the practices of self-care and spirituality that sustain me through the trials and joys of life. I'm a morning prayer person. So that is kind of the ground of my spiritual life and being. And that is the point from which sort of all other prayer flows. That's where I have my time of reflecting on parishioners, things in my own life, what's going on at Epiphany that I need to pray for, what's going on in the world that I need to pray for. That's kind of just the ground and being of my life. Self-care is something that I believe in strongly, and I have been pretty disciplined about it. Certainly I am somebody who does take her days off. I took a sabbatical last year, and I took my work email off my phone the first night, and I felt like I was doing something naughty, but I did, and for 3 months, I didn't look at a single church email. And someone from the diocese asked me to look at one, and I said no. And so those are things that I do for self-care. The things I do, I have hobbies outside of the church, which I think are really important for self-care. I used to be a beach volleyball player. I've mostly given that up now in favor of rock climbing. I hear you have some rocks in Arizona. And the other thing I do for fun right now is I play golf. And golf is something that I took up a couple years ago. I'd played a little bit when I was growing up with my dad, but when you're 12 and your choices are, I was a soccer player, playing soccer or playing golf with your dad, pretty easy to decide to play soccer. So I didn't play golf much for about 30 years, and then I took it up again. And I have discovered that golf is golf works on all of my spiritual issues. Because I have had to learn more about forgiving myself in playing golf than in any other spiritual practice. Because I am an athlete who is really good at sports that, you train and then you react. You never have to think. And when you're playing golf and it's just you and the ball, and you have to think about what you're doing and where you're going and when you're hitting it. And then if you hit it badly, as I often do because I am not a good golfer, you have to hit it again. And the last hit, you have to just let that go. And if you're still angry about the last hit, the next hit is not going to go well. And so that has been, I was not expecting golf to be a spiritual discipline, but it has actually been remarkably good for me at sort of smoothing over one of those edges. And how I nurture my soul, I certainly worship. I love worship, and I love getting to be in worship and not just lead worship. I love spending time with my son. The fun thing I did for my soul and for my son the last spring was to coach his Little League team. And again, I learned so much by interacting with non-church people in a children's ministry, where you couldn't fall back on all of my Jesus language, but you still had to instill all of those values and ethics and sportsmanship. And that was, playing in Central Park in the spring every Saturday was just joy and bliss.
Tell about a crisis of faith you've experienced and how you walked through it.
So I think my most recent sort of crisis of faith was when I was divorced. That was about 5 years ago. And, it was, I guess at some level it wasn't a crisis of faith. Like it was a crisis. And it taught me a lot about Episcopal pastoral care, because I had to go to my bishop and say, the most important relationship in my life is falling apart. And I don't know what to do, and I have to tell you because, people are going to notice, and I don't know what to do. And he listened, and he let me cry, and he offered help. He offered his prayers, certainly, and he checked in with me. He offered financial help, which was important. It's expensive to get divorced and move out on your own and pay for therapy. But I did all that, and in looking at the possibility of being a bishop, it has reminded me of the importance of being present for clergy and lay people, but particularly as a pastor to clergy. That you have to be someone who has a relationship with all the clergy such that they can come to you with the worst news in their life and know that that news will be held safely and lovingly and prayerfully. But as I went through my divorce process, it was, I discovered that God loved me anyway, even if I had failed at the most important relationship in my life, and that God could forgive me for having to start life over again, and that I could be supported by my friends and by my parish. And part of that is because I have an amazing ex-husband who, we still work together, we still care for each other. We kept asking ourselves as we were getting divorced, what is the loving thing to do? But as we went through, we wrote a letter together to the parish saying, this is happening. We don't know what's going to happen ultimately, but, please keep us in your prayers and please give us privacy. And my parish was able to do that. They held us in their hands. They dealt with the Sunday after we sent that letter, the epistle was, what is it from Romans? Suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. And I got up in the pulpit and I preached on that because I believe it. But boy, was it hard. And boy, were there a lot of tears. And I had a parish that I could trust to hold those tears. And I made it through the other side. And I have made it through. I know this was something in my bio that may have caused some people some consternation. I am a divorced woman, and I'm dating someone, because if you're single and you might like to get married again, you have to go through a period of dating. And that's where we are. And Paul has been a friend of mine for over 20 years. We met in college, and nothing ever happened, 15, 18 years ago, because he was living in Hong Kong, and we were both too smart to get into a long-distance relationship. And, we're not getting any younger. And so my life doesn't look the way that I expected it to, or the way I hoped it would, but it does look a lot like the lives of people in your parish. And I think that's an important thing to model in a bishop, that we don't have one particular role, family life anymore. We have families of all different kinds. And we can speak to that and preach that as good news and not as bad news.
Forum number 2, diocesan life. What do you feel is the relationship of a bishop to various ministry groups, lay and ordained?
I think it depends. I kind of wonder what's behind this question. What is causing the Diocese of Arizona to ask this question about this? Because it sounds like there is some consternation about either the bishop being too involved or not involved enough. And I'm not sure which of those is the concern. So I think the relationship of a bishop to various ministry groups, I don't think the ministry of a diocese should be the ministry of a bishop. The bishop enables the ministry of the diocese. The bishop doesn't come down ex machina and say, hi, your ministry is now this. But the bishop does call people together in ministry. The bishop does identify ministries that need to grow and thrive and get more attention. And the bishop may sometimes also identify ministries that need to die an honorable death. And we're Christians, so death is not bad. Death is not the end. We believe in resurrection. So when we say that something has come to its end, that's okay. I think as a bishop, I'm sure there are ministries that I would want to be involved with. I've definitely seen bishops who really shone a light on a ministry or two and had them grow and thrive. But I don't yet know, despite learning as much as I can about your diocese, really, what are those ministries? And I'm sure there are ministries that are going to grow and thrive no matter what the bishop does. And they should be allowed to do so. One of the things that I've learned as a rector is that if something is not broken, don't muck it up. You know, if you have a bunch of lay people who are running a ministry, don't insert yourself into it. Let them minister. And I would hope to have a similar approach as a bishop.
Second question. The Union of Black Episcopalians has been a strong advocate for justice in the diocese. What are your ideas and experiences on racism? How do you envision the diocese supporting marginalized communities and ministries that serve with them?
So UB is awesome. I know they had a big festival a couple months ago. I think it was in the Bahamas. And my Facebook feed was full of everybody just dancing and celebrating. And I thought, wow, that is great. You know, it is great that UBE has done such amazing things. I remember at General Seminary, the poster of Black bishops of the Episcopal Church. And, as a white person, I looked at that and I thought, that's really cool. And I still had some questions about I was my own biases were there, that's great and that's model, but I don't feel much connection to that until I experienced for the first time to see a female bishop. And I discovered how much representation mattered, because the first time I met Kathy Roscom, it was Ascension Day of 2000. I remember it. It was at Holy Apostles Church. I was singing in the choir. And I remember thinking, well, I've seen female priests and I've seen bishops. And having someone who is, a female bishop, that won't be much different. And then she came in there and she sang the Mozarabic preface. And I was just in awe that there was a bishop who looked like me. And so I understand how important it is to have leadership that looks like you. In my parish, we have clergy who are white and clergy who are Black. We have clergy who are male, clergy who are female. We do our best to have a vestry that represents ethnically our parish. I think the diocese is the same, My experience with racism as a white person is to become increasingly aware of it, and to work and speak up as a white person about racism from my position of privilege. In the diocese, I've done the anti-racism training that we do, and I don't know, I said this last night, I said, what do you do for anti-racism training? But there's no way for me to get that answer from you, because I'm not allowed to ask you questions. But I would like to know, because the Diocese of New York's anti-racism training is actually pretty good, and if we don't have good anti-racism training, we should import that here, because it really focuses on systems, rather than just sort of individual experiences. And for the diocese supporting marginalized communities and the ministry that serve with them, we are called to minister not just to the people in the church, but the people outside the church. And sometimes the people in the marginalized communities are inside the church too. And so we need to be able to speak compellingly to all of that. I'm going to wait to do something else in the next question. Now, this is really great. Last night we didn't have all the questions. We only had one question at a time, so you didn't know what was coming next. Now we can know what is coming. I think that's enough for that answer now.
Okay. Forum number 3, the church and the world. Multicultural ministries are found in every corner of the Episcopal Church, and the Diocese of Arizona is no different. But at the same time, there are significant challenges and opportunities before us. Arizona is a border state, and immigration issues represent a here and now response. How willing are you to enter this arena and others as our bishop and spiritual leader? What might that look like?
So, you're all a really interesting state. And you're a state we hear about even in New York. Your Sheriff Joe Arpaio is a name that is known. And so I have some familiarity with some of the border issues, but I have to say, having read Bishop Smith's book on bishops on the border, I think he does a really good job of getting people to sort of ground their experience of border issues in their own experience and talk about his own transformation. And that's a transformation that I have not yet had the privilege to do. I would hope that if I were called as your bishop, one of the first things I would be able to do would be to go down to the border and get that sort of firsthand experience of seeing people, meeting them, talking to them. And I've also been very impressed with Bishop Smith and his statements. You know, we're living in a world right now where there are 12,000 children in detention. And that's not okay. And when I've talked with people in my own parish and taught about this, about immigration just in general, one of the things I've found helpful has been to invite people to reflect upon their own story of being a stranger. Because in Scripture, whenever the Gospel or whenever the Hebrew Bible talks about, you know, be gentle to the stranger or love the stranger, because remember, you were strangers in Egypt. You know, it's grounded in their own experience, the people of Israel, of having been strangers. And the good thing about being in the United States is that unless you're Native American, your people have been strangers here too. And so to invite people to reflect upon, you know, what was it like when your ancestors were strangers? And for me, one of the things that leapt out this year as I was reflecting on that was hearing stories of some ancestors of mine who fled Germany about 1870 or so at ages 12 and 14. And their parents sent them from Germany to Chicago to get away from being conscripted in the army. And I think of how bad it must have been to make those parents do that with their children. You know, to put them on a boat, not know if they would survive the crossing, not know if they'd ever see them again, not know really what waited for them, but having confidence that whatever they were going to experience on that journey and in that destination was better than what they were going to have at home. So I think about the fact that some of my ancestors were unaccompanied minors. And so when I see the stories of people fleeing today, I think, wow, that is my people 150 years ago. How would I have wanted my ancestors to be treated? And how should I treat people today? Aprendí un poco de español durante el verano de 2001. No hablo muy fluido, pero puedo celebrar en español y predicar en español más o menos. Y estoy poniendo mi mayor esfuerzo en mejorarlo para que en corto tiempo puedo dominarlo y entablar una conversación con facilidad. Entiendo que el ministerio en Arizona es un ministerio que requiere un obispo que domine el inglés y el español. Y doy mi palabra que si me llaman como su obispo, estaré preparada para ambos idiomas. Now, how many of you did not understand that? So you've just experienced what it's like to be a Spanish-speaking Episcopalian, which is we have all these diocesan gatherings, right? And everyone's talking in English, and then you worship, and maybe you read the gospel in Spanish, and you sing a couple songs, but we are not really a bilingual church yet, for the most part, and we need to be. And what I said, because I'll let you know, because we do try to translate stuff, is that I've studied some Spanish. I'm not fluent. I can celebrate in Spanish. I can preach a little bit in Spanish. But I'm working as hard as I can to get fluent so that I can maintain a conversation. And I understand that the ministry in Arizona is a ministry that needs and deserves a bishop that speaks both languages. And that's true not just in Arizona, that's true in every diocese of the Episcopal Church. Because the bishop is the bishop of the whole diocese and not just the English-speaking parishes. And that is something that would be a big growth area for me, because like I said, I'm not conversational. Every day on my Duolingo app, I'm working hard, and I look forward to having conversation partners and practicing. But it's something I am fully committed to were I to become your bishop. Actually, it's something I'm fully committed to do whether I'm your bishop or not, because it's an important thing for ministry.
What does the church have to offer the world when it comes to peace and reconciliation?
Everything. I mean, we are the ones who follow the great reconciler, right? And reconciliation is the fundamental ministry of the church. And if you go to the catechism and you read what's the ministry of the church, it's to reconcile all people to one another in Christ. And so we have a really distinct voice to offer the church, the world, excuse me. We have a really distinct voice for the church too, but the world is hungry for a message of love. And we saw that with, the royal wedding sermon. The next week, Michael Curry is on every daytime talk program because everybody wanted to hear that message of love. Everybody thought it was so exotic that there was a Christian who was talking about love and peace and reconciliation and, loving your neighbor and loving God and Jesus, but not in a scary Jesus way. And so I think we have to proclaim that more boldly. And we can do that in a lot of ways. One of the ways that, one of the things that has been most satisfying for me this past year was getting appointed to that House of Deputies subcommittee on, sexual harassment and abuse. And to be particularly on the truth and reconciliation part of it, because that was the topic I was most interested in. And the parts of that, to some extent modeled on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that we need to have truth before we can have reconciliation. And so truth is something that is in short supply these days. And so I feel like the church is in a unique position to start to get at some of those truths. And those are going to be hard truths for us. And sexual harassment is a place where it's going to be a really hard truth for us. One of the things that we did in that, and the part of it that I particularly worked on, was that I feel like in the church we don't really believe that sexual harassment is that big a deal as a church, in the church. And so there's no commonly understood truth to it. And so in our subcommittee we started talking about, well, how can we get people to understand the truth of it? How can we understand the truth of it? Maybe we're making all this up. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just you. We know it's not. But so we said maybe we should do a survey. Could we do a survey of the whole Episcopal Church? Well, who would do that? How would we get that done? Could the pension fund do it? Where would it fit? Well, what we discovered is that the Methodists beat us to it. The Methodists did this survey, and not only have they done the survey, they've done it 3 times. They've done it every 10 years. And they just did it in 2017, and what that survey showed, that in the Methodist Church, and I see no reason to think that it would be any different in the Episcopal Church, over 60% of Methodists had experienced sexual harassment or assault at their church. And that's not okay. And we need to get to that truth so we can get to reconciliation, and probably with some justice thrown in too. And there are ways we can do that. We can make, Title IV processes more accessible. We can find alternate ways of doing that have a more reconciling and less punitive aspect to them. We can do new trainings. We can find out what other churches are doing and see if maybe one church's process works better. If the Methodists have done this and we've basically worked, the resolution was passed, now I think we're going to do the survey with the same researcher who did the Methodist survey. If we could have data from 2 different, similar denominations on this, and then maybe we got the Lutherans to do it too, maybe we could find out what worked better, right? And if what the Lutherans are doing is working better, we should do that. And then we could get to a point where we could model for the world what it's like to have an injustice, to work on it together, and then to be reconciled one to another. And that would be such good news for the world, in addition to being good news for our church. The end of the questions.
The first forum questions are on personal spiritual life. What practices of self-care and spirituality sustain you through the trials and joys of life, and how do you nurture your soul?
When I think about my spiritual life, it's not just about my relationship with God, but it's also about my relationship with my family and friends, with other people in the world around me. And so the practices that I engage in are practices that try to nurture those relationships. First, I pray I pray a lot. I pray in the morning, engaging with some passage from Scripture, particularly a passage in which Jesus appears. And I always, I'm asking myself, what does this passage have to say to me right here, right now, at this point in my life? And then, of course, I also pray by lifting up those people in my life, in my congregation, whose needs and concerns, hopes and dreams need to be brought to God. So that's in the morning. In the evening, I pray the ancient prayer of the examen, which I talked about during the plenary session, I believe. And that, again, is a review of the day and how I've experienced God moving through my life that day. In addition to that, I have a spiritual director with whom I meet. That relationship is vital to me and my relationship with God. It gives me an opportunity to reflect on my prayer life with another person. And I go on retreat. I take time to be with God every year. I spend time with my family as much as possible. As you heard in the introduction, Susan and I have 3 boys. They're all in their 20s now. They are gainfully employed, which is great, but it also means we don't get to see them as much. So when we have time to be together, the 5 of us to be together, that is a priority for me. And the same goes with family and friends, other family members and other friends that we have. I also exercise a lot. Exercise to me is a spiritual practice. It's how I care for this body which God has given me. And my most passionate exercise is running. I try to run several times a week, different distances. And before I start running, I devote that time to God. Recently, I also took up the practice of yoga. It's my new obsession. I practice yoga a couple of times a week, and it's a wonderful way to integrate mindfulness, presence together with my physical being. So those are some of the spiritual practices that I use to get me through the daily life. Then there was a second part, and I always forget the second parts of these questions. How do I nurture my soul? It's really through those spiritual practices that nurture my soul. It's how I find joy and happiness in God's presence each and every day. What I'm really trying to strive for in my life is to feel God with me each and every moment of the day. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it. And it's those practices that help me get closer and closer.
Okay, second question. Tell about a crisis of faith you've experienced and how you walked through it.
When I first graduated from college, I spent 10 to 15 years working in the financial markets. Ever since I was a young boy, my father used to take me through the stock tables, and I always imagined myself as the next Warren Buffett. And when I graduated from college, that was what I had in my mind. And so working in the financial markets for the first few years while I was in my 20s was great fun. I loved it. But after those first few years, it didn't feed my soul. I found that work unfulfilling. And I knew that I needed to make a change. So I began asking myself, what am I going to do with my life? That big question. At the time, I didn't know the word discernment, but I was embarking on a process of discernment about my life. I continued working in the financial markets, but our family was attending the local Episcopal church. We had been for years, and I started to get more and more active. I taught 8th grade confirmation class, led youth group, led the men's group. Just like most of you probably, I had all of these different ministries going on in my church. And I found that work tremendously fulfilling. What I was doing on Sundays, particularly with the youth, fed my soul in a way that my Monday through Friday work didn't. And after years, and I mean years, I came to this conclusion, this realization that God was calling me to ordain ministry. Now, we know it's not quite as simple as that, right? It takes years, and there's a lot of thought and prayer and stuff that goes into this. And I did all of that. But I came to this conclusion that God wanted me to be ordained. And so I began the process of moving towards ordination. I met with my parish discernment committee and then moved on to the diocese level and met with the Commission on Ministry. And everything was going great. Everything was going great. The bishop gave me permission to start looking at seminaries. This was in the spring. I wasn't quite a postulant yet, which is a fancy church word for saying that the bishop sort of okayed me to go to seminary and on the way to ordination. But he said, go ahead and look at seminaries. So we began looking, and we were going to go to Virginia Seminary, but I still had one more hurdle to cross with the Commission on Ministry, and that was a discernment retreat, where I had to spend a day with members of the Commission on Ministry, a group of about as many people sitting here in the front row, and they asked me all sorts of questions, and as the day unfolded, it wasn't going well. And I knew it. I wasn't articulating my sense of call. I wasn't articulating what God meant to me in my life. But the problem was, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to change course in the middle of this retreat. And I knew that the Commission on Ministry would not recommend me to the bishop. And sure enough, I got a call that night. I was not recommended. I had spent years discerning this call. I was 150% certain that this is what God wanted me to do with my life. As certain as anything I had ever felt in my life. This is what God was calling me to do. I heard God tell me, I want you to be ordained. But God didn't tell the Commission on Ministry. And that hurt. And I was angry. I was angry at God. I was angry at the members of the Commission on Ministry. I was angry. How could God put me through this? I had spent years discerning this call. How could God do this to me? And that was my low spiritual moment. And even today, I can get emotional thinking about it. How did I work through it? It took time. It took a lot of time. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. All of our plans had just been upended. And then a few weeks after this discernment retreat, I got a call from a woman at church with whom I led youth group. And she said, "Andrew, you're great with youth. You need to be a teacher. Here's the phone number of some friends of mine that help place teachers at schools. Call them." And it wasn't really like she was recommending I do this or suggesting I do this. She was telling me to do this. And I did it. And so for 5 years, I taught high school mathematics, mostly to 9th and 10th graders. I coached junior varsity basketball, girls junior varsity soccer. I was an advisor to about 8 students a year. And I loved it. Each and every moment, I would go to school excited to see those students, and that work was so fulfilling to me. And finding that calling gave me the time I needed to step back from church for a while, to let some of the anger go, to once again be open to God. And after I had been teaching for about 3 years, loving every minute of it, my call to ordained ministry came back. I was still so fulfilled in teaching, but there was just something inside of me saying, "You need to be ordained." And so I went through the process again. And you know how it turned out. But it took time and prayer. It took love and support of family, friends, my rector, whose support never wavered.
Diocesan life. What do you feel is the relationship of a bishop to various ministry groups, lay and ordained?
Relationships have been at the heart of the Christian faith since Jesus called the first disciples. And relationships are at the heart of my ministry. It is getting to know the people in my parish that feeds me and energizes me. And it's in them that I see the Holy Spirit moving each and every day, in the way that they love their parish, the way they're willing to give time to serve the Lord through their ministries. My hope would be to have close relationships with the clergy and lay leaders of the diocese. That would mean so much to me. And I've heard a need for that as I've spoken to people in the diocese. A closer relationship with the bishop. A bishop who's really a chief pastor. And that's the kind of bishop I aspire to be. My first priority, if I was called to be the Bishop of Arizona, would be to spend time getting to know all of you. I really want to do that.
The Union of Black Episcopalians has been a strong advocate for justice in the diocese. What are your ideas and experience on racism? How do you envision the diocese supporting marginalized communities and ministries that serve with them?
I serve a congregation that is racially diverse. We are about 60% Anglo or white, about 35% Black, by which I mean African American, Afro-Caribbean, West African, and then 5% Asian and Hispanic. I've been the rector of that church for 8 years. And I remember my very first day as rector, I had given a sermon at our 8 o'clock service, and then we were having an adult forum, an opportunity for parishioners to meet the new rector. And I can still see our undercroft, which is the church basement where we were meeting, and I was sitting at a table, and an older parishioner, person of color, raised his hand and asked me, "What experience do you have ministering to people who look like me?" Hubbada, 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 hubbada. I sort of fumbled my way through an answer because the truth is, it wasn't a lot at that point. And since then, I have learned and grown in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. Getting to know these parishioners who come from a different background than I do. Parishioners for whom this country hasn't always been kind. Parishioners who have felt the brunt of racism, of being pushed aside, ignored, pushed down. And for me, it was a painful learning experience because I realized there was so much happening out in the world of which I was not aware and had no clue. But listening to their stories, I began to feel the Holy Spirit moving within me. A voice saying, we need to get involved here. When there was a lot of news being made about police officers shooting young men of color, several different parishioners came to me and said, "Andrew, we need to do something. We need to speak out. We can't remain silent." And so those two things sort of came together. This discernment that I was going through, telling me that we needed to do something about the racial injustices in this country. And then these parishioners coming to me and saying, "Andrew, we need to get involved." And so we began a racial justice ministry. We believed that because people in our congregation loved our diversity more than anything, that we could be a unifying voice for racial justice. People of different races coming together to live out our baptismal covenants and to say, no more. This ministry came up with a 5-year plan. And our goal is to be the church and faith-based institution in our community known for fighting racial injustices. We began our work by looking at ourselves because we felt we could not go out into the world and speak about issues until we had done all of the internal work that we needed to do. And so we spent almost 2 years sitting together as a parish, talking about our experiences of race, listening to other people's experience of racism, learning and growing.
The church and the world. Multicultural ministries are found in every quarter of the Episcopal Church, and the Diocese of Arizona is no different. But at the same time, there are significant challenges and opportunities before us. Arizona is a border state, and immigration issues represent a here and now response. How willing are you to enter this arena and others as our bishop and spiritual leader? And what might that look like?
I want to go back to the last question and just finish another thought. If I was called to serve as Bishop of Arizona, that work for racial justice would continue. We would do it together. That's very important to me to say. Thank you. Sorry. Could you read that next one again?
Multicultural ministries are found in every corner of the Episcopal Church, and the Diocese of Arizona is no different. But at the same time, there are significant challenges and opportunities before us. Arizona is a border state, and immigration issues represent a here and now response. How willing are you to enter this arena and others as our bishop and spiritual leader, and what might that look like?
So yes, I would be willing to enter into that arena, as I just alluded to in my previous response. There is a clear biblical mandate to care for the foreigner, the stranger, the immigrant, and the refugee. Christians across denominations agree on that. Pretty much. And there are no qualifiers to that biblical mandate. The Bible doesn't say care for the foreigner, the stranger, the immigrant if they've only come here legally. The Bible just says care for the foreigner, care for the stranger, care for the immigrant. There are no qualifiers. And I would proudly stand up and say that publicly as Bishop of Arizona. Now, I don't have the experience dealing with immigration issues like all of you do. I currently serve in Washington, D.C. But I am familiar with some of the challenges around refugees. Because several years ago, probably about a year and a half ago, as the plight of refugees around the world was reaching staggering proportions, a few different parishioners came to me and said, "Andrew, we should sponsor a refugee family from another country." And I said, "Great, go talk amongst yourselves and come back." And those three people gathered a few other parishioners. They came up with a whole plan. They did all of the research. They found the partner organization with whom we would work. They laid out a budget of what it would cost to sponsor a refugee family for a year. And they brought it to me, and we brought it to the vestry. And the vestry bought into the whole plan. And so we committed to sponsoring a refugee family for 1 year. This was late last winter, early last spring. We held a fundraiser, and in one night raised $40,000 to sponsor this family from another country. The generosity of people and the support of people for this ministry was mind-blowing. At the time, we were number 7 on the list of churches to receive a refugee family. This was last May, number 7. You know where we are now? We're number 5. In all of these months, we've only moved up 2 spots because the number of refugees being allowed into the country has been cut drastically. Recently, we've been trying to regroup and ask ourselves, what are we going to do if it's taken all of these months and we've only moved up 2 spots? Who knows how long it will take until we can actually sponsor a refugee family? And our ministry leaders came back and said, well, maybe there's a family that's already here that needs our help. And that's what we're going to do. We're looking for a family right now whose church support has expired and is still in need of help, and we're committed to helping a family. That's the kind of work. I know you're doing it here in Arizona, and as Bishop of Arizona, if I was called to serve here, I would continue to support that sort of work and ministry with my voice, with my presence, and my heart.
What does the church have to offer the world when it comes to peace and reconciliation?
Hope. We believe in something that's almost impossible to believe, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And that changes everything. If that is possible, peace and righteousness and justice is possible. And as people gathered here tonight who believe in that resurrection, who have experienced the resurrection, because I know you would not be here if you had not experienced the love of God in Jesus yourselves. As people who have experienced that, we need to preach it and live it and give people hope that all of the stuff that we're experiencing in the world right now, the division, the hate, that those things will not have the last word. Love will have the last word. That's our message.
Forum number 1 is on personal spiritual life. What practices of self-care and spirituality sustain you through the trials and joys of life? And how do you nurture your soul?
Thank you. The practices of self-care and spirituality that I engage in are several. First is that I have a deep and ongoing practice of prayer, and that takes several forms. One is that I engage regularly in centering prayer, which is the opportunity to be quiet and present and to seek to attune myself to the presence of God. I like to think of it as when, in the Martha and Mary story, when Mary sat at the feet of Jesus and gave him her full attention. Or when Mary, the mother of Jesus, took all those things and pondered them in her heart. It's that opportunity to set aside all the busyness and all the noise in daily life and to seek to be present to God and to open myself up so that I might listen more attentively, or at least just practice being for a while in God's presence. Another is that I enjoy doing the Brother Lawrence practice of the presence of God. And when I describe that to the confirmation class, I say it's like having an invisible friend. It's remembering that really God is wherever you are. Now, Brother Lawrence was feeling extremely crabby and put upon because he got stuck with kitchen duty when the other monks had far more glamorous chores, he perceived, than he did. And he got over his crankiness by practicing the belief that Jesus was there with him when he washed the dishes and pots and pans. And it really changed his entire attitude about the things he needed to do in his everyday life so that they became a spiritual practice, because he learned to really realize that he was always in the presence of God. I'm not where Brother Lawrence was, but as often as I can, I remind myself that whatever I am doing, it is in the presence of God. And I find that really helpful for me. It can be a good attitude adjustment when I'm in my cranky mood like he was. Another thing I do is just the really practical thing is that I can be a high energy person, and I need some way to sort of dissipate that energy constructively, especially in winter in Syracuse when we got 153 inches of snow last year. So it doesn't always mean we can get outside, but I like to do two things. One is when it's possible, I like to go walking. So I walk, and I think of it as a meditative walk, although often to people they'll say, I saw you jogging, or power walking. But I usually walk 3 miles. So my first mile is that mile where I'm trying to slow down the hamster wheel that's going in my head, all that stuff that I have to do and think about. And the second mile is when I can start to kind of just let go of things. And that third mile is when I'm able to pray, because the rest of it has dissipated enough that can kind of fall away and I can pray. And that's a wonderful thing for me. So part of my prayer life is being able to move. Another complement to that is I was a dancer for 23 years. So I still think of myself as a dancer, although I'm not involved in any form of dance at the moment. So if you see me standing in first position, you'll know why. And so what I do is yoga, because it's very similar to dance. It's very body aware, it's flowing, but it's really the opportunity to practice being fully present and engaged, spiritually, physically, and mindfully. And I find that extremely helpful for me. It's sort of a form of prayer life and meditation. And in fact, yoga was developed to be able to move through all of the asanas, which are the poses, which is what most people think, oh, exercise, right? So that you can sit down and meditate. That's why it was designed. So I do that, and I probably practice yoga 3 to 5 times a week, depending on the week. And I find that tremendously helpful for me. And then there was another part to that question. How do you nurture your soul? Well, beyond those things, and of course, being part of an amazing congregation, which helps nurture my soul, is that I find it a wonderful thing to be in sustaining relationships with other people. And the first and foremost one of those that I can name is the fact that I get to be married to an amazing and wonderful man named David, and have been for 31 years. And when you have someone who is your soulmate, literally, my anamkara or soul friend, it's a really different kind of way to go through life, with someone with whom I can actually be my true self and know that I am accepted and loved the way I am, and encouraged and supported for the person that I am, and that I can trust him to give me honest feedback on whatever is going on, and that I can do the same for him. And so that makes all manner of other things in life possible, because if I know I can have this kind of relationship with him, that can only happen through the grace of God. And it gives me the idea that maybe I can have those kinds of open, honest, vulnerable, loving, holy relationships with other people too, which is what God wants us to be able to do, is to have those kinds of life-changing, transformative relationships, because that is when Christ is working in and through us, and we can see it shining out from one another.
Okay. Tell about a crisis of faith you've experienced and how you walked through it.
I'll tell you about 2. I don't know that I'd call them crises, but we'll certainly go with challenges. So one was more practical, but sometimes it's the practical things in life that are frightening. When I first got to Christ Church, I learned through their delayed audit that they owed $477,000 in a construction loan. And it was due in 18 months. And there had been no plan. So after my initial panicked, hair on fire kind of reaction, I did the first thing I always do, which is I go and I sit down and I'm like, oh, okay, we just start with breathing and praying. Breathe, pray, and then together develop a plan. Because you have to start with where you are and go from there. Because panic, other than for a few moments, really doesn't help in the long term. And we needed to find a way to get through this together. And we did. We figured out a way to get a mortgage, to raise money, to have a successful stewardship campaign, to be able to have a capital campaign that not only exceeded our initial goal by 28%, but allowed us through early payments to reduce the $477,000 price tag to under $150 in 3 years. And one thing we learned by getting through that together is that we could really trust God to help us get through the difficult times, that we were not going to abandon one another just because we were anxious, and that this was possible, that we could invest ourselves together and we could accomplish more than we might have thought was possible. The other is more personal, because that was a little more professional, and that is that 6 years ago, my mother went to bed and died in her sleep. No warning, no idea that that was going to happen. She was taking care of my father, who had just come out of the hospital when she died in her sleep. So we had to go to Atlanta, which is 16 hours from where we live, and move my father back to Syracuse with us and clean out their 3,500 square foot home and sell it. So we moved him up to Syracuse, and for 4.5 years, he lived about 15 minutes away from us in an assisted living facility. For 2 years, he did really well. I mean, we got him back to health. He was doing well. We visited him every day. And on the days we were out of town, we called him to make sure that he was doing well. And we watched countless episodes of NCIS together. So we still watch NCIS because it always makes me think of my dad. He was a retired military colonel, so you can see the connection. And then my dad got esophageal cancer, which means he had to have his voice box removed. And then he had to have chemo once a week on Tuesdays for 12 weeks, radiation 5 days a week for 12 weeks, and then slowly faded away because he just lost so much weight and so much strength that he couldn't hang on. But we got to be at his bedside. I got to give him last rites and his last communion. I got to whip out the cell phone, for which I was very grateful, and call everyone he wanted to say goodbye to so that he could say goodbye. I got to hold his hand as he died. I got to bless his body afterwards. And because my parents, in their infinite uniqueness, had made the pledge to one another that when one of them died, the other one would not have a service because it would be too hard for the one who was still alive, I got to have a service for both of them after he died. So we had the service at Christ Church, and the congregation turned out, and a lot of my clergy colleagues showed up. People were wonderful. They were wonderful. We had a wonderful service for both my parents. The honor guard came. It was amazing. And then this past February, we went to Arlington and interred their ashes with full military honors. So what I learned from that was, as hard as it was to walk through 4.5 years of visiting someone every day, of knowing NCIS so well I could recite many of the dialogues with you, of being able to watch my father die, to be with him through that difficult process, to do their service, to go down to Arlington, is that I could walk through this with you. I know what it is to lose and to grieve, to love a curmudgeonly old man who wears his hat with the jump wings on it and walks down the hall wanting everybody to call him Colonel in his crusty, old, adorable self way, and to both grieve and celebrate his life and his loss. And to think that I can come through that because I was upheld by the love of God and the people around me who made it possible to show me their love when it was difficult, and that I learned how important and essential it is to be surrounded by loving, caring community, and that I want to offer that to other people in return, and that we can do that for one another. It doesn't make it easy, but it makes it possible.
Diocesan life.
Yes, ma'am.
What do you feel is the relationship of a bishop to various ministry groups, lay and ordained?
Well, in the Episcopal Church, we tend to do organizations well. We like things decently and in good order. We like efficiency. We like organization. Who doesn't have an organizational chart in their parish? Everybody, right? Usually a flow chart looks sort of like a pyramid, maybe a couple little funky detours on the pyramid, but you've got a flow chart. You know how things work. Excel spreadsheet, QuickBooks. All right, so we do the organizational part well. And that's good when it comes to information or who needs to do what. To know the, as my dad would say, the proper chain of command. It doesn't always do so much for explaining how relationships should work. So relationships can be a little different. So there are two models for that I really look at in terms of how a bishop might work with congregations and with the clergy in a diocese. And one is that of a hub, to have a wheel where the bishop, instead of being at the top of the pyramid, is the hub. And for every spoke, it goes out to every congregation, through the leaders of the congregation, to the wider wheel, which is all the members of the congregation. And it flows back and forth, until I would have the opportunity to know everyone. But really, in a diocese the size of Arizona, the prospect of knowing each and every Episcopalian well is a little daunting. But I can still be connected through your clergy leaders and lay leaders on those spokes that come into the hub. So none is necessarily prioritized one over the other. They're all relational. But that doesn't capture all of it. Beyond even that, if you were to imagine, because I'm a visual person without a flip chart, you draw the wheel with the hub and the spokes, and then overlay that with a web. Because what we need to do in any context is weave a web of relationships. So there are people who might not be on any one spoke, and yet I'm going to get to meet them and to know them, whether it's at Chapel Rock, whether I show up at your church and someone comes to a parish dinner, whether they decide they want to be involved in a particular ministry, whether they come to an ordination for someone that they love. There's going to be a whole beautiful web of relationships that get woven. And that's what helps strengthen the entire diocese, is to have that functional, beautiful, important web of relationships. Because you know how spider webs always look so delicate and yet they're so strong? That's what those relationships can be.
The Union of Black Episcopalians has been a strong advocate for justice in the diocese. What are your ideas and experience on racism? How do you envision the diocese supporting marginalized communities and ministries that serve with them?
Right. In the Diocese of Central New York, I am the co-founder and chair of the Diocesan Anti-Racism Team. When I arrived there, I learned to my dismay that despite a General Convention resolution requiring that all clergy and lay leaders in every diocese go through anti-racism training, 14 years later, that hadn't happened. And that to me said that there was really no waiting around for someone else to do that. Because if it hadn't happened yet, that communicates something important and deeply unfortunate to people. And one of their favorite things to say was, well, we don't need any racism training. We hardly have any black people in our congregations. I wonder why that might be. So a colleague and I, he went and got training because I already had it. We offered a workshop at the ministry fair, thinking we might get 20 people who would come. And from that, we could form a team. We had 60 people who came. We were thrilled. So we formed a team, and we partnered with our neighbors in the Diocese of Rochester to learn how to offer a training together. And they came to our first one and walked through it with us. We had 60 people come to the first training. And then, because I can be a little creative, I was chair of Clergy Continuing Ed on the Commission on Ministry. So guess what our next Clergy Continuing Education Day was? Anti-racism training. And we got 80% of the clergy through anti-racism training that day, which was a wonderful thing. And now we've offered the training in every geographical area of the diocese, and we moved on from basic anti-racism training to working toward becoming the beloved community and dismantling racism. We had Dr. Catherine Meeks from the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta come as our keynote speaker for Ministry Fair. And we're going on a pilgrimage this coming year in 2019 down to Atlanta and to some of the important sites for the civil rights movement in our country. So we've done a lot to address racism in our diocese. And we are also looking at supporting other marginalized community like the Sudanese, for whom we've raised up a member of the Sudanese congregation, Mother Amour, to be their clergy. And for the Native Americans who are on the Onondaga Reservation, which is part of right near our diocese, or actually within our diocese, with whom the relationship is tenuous due to a few bishops ago, and with whom our bishop is trying to establish a new rapport. So we're reaching out as we are able to marginalized communities to include them and serve with them.
The church and the world.
Thank you.
Multicultural ministries are found in every corner of the Episcopal Church, and the Diocese of Arizona is no different. But at the same time, there are significant challenges and opportunities before us. Arizona is a border state, and immigration issues represent a here and now response. How willing are you to enter this arena and others as our bishop and spiritual leader? And what might that look like?
Well, we're a border state, but it's a really different border where we live. We don't have Canadians flooding in. Well, unless they're going to Destiny USA, the big shopping mall. So for you, it's a really present and pressing concern to deal in a way that's appropriate. So I find, as someone who is a person of Christ, that the most important thing in any response, as I will tell people, well, I was a political science major in college. I worked for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. I worked on political campaigns. My husband has too. In fact, 3 of the campaigns we've worked on have been for parishioners. So I'm not averse to dealing with politics. But for me, when I've had parishioners ask me, so how do you decide what your politics are? And I say, my politics are the gospel. Because to me, what we believe in terms of politics should come from what we believe in terms of our response of faith to the needs of the world. Politics for me is something that is a response to our faith. We don't take our faith and craft it to support our politics. So anything that I would do as a bishop in response to what is perceived as a political situation would be something that is gospel-based. So I begin with the Bible and what we learn there about faithful responses, whether they are Old Testament or New Testament, whether we're being called to serve justice and love kindness and walk humbly with our God, whether we're learning, as my congregation can now say with me, because I've learned to have them know this one by heart, what does Jesus say are the 2 most important commandments? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So our question in any political situation is really, how are we responding to our neighbor in a way that shows the love of God and the love of neighbor? What would that look like in this context? So I come to the question and I say, it's really that what would Jesus do moment. What is the loving thing to do here? And that should craft any political response we have. So I'm not afraid to enter that arena in any way. I mean, I could stand before caucus and explain amendments to bills and legislation. I'm one of those nerdy people who likes going to general convention because I can do legislation. I'm like, ooh, good times. I've marched twice with the bishops against gun violence. I own an orange stole, but really only because Maria brought it from Guatemala after the medical mission, but I found a new purpose for it, besides wearing it on SU game days. So I think it's important to get first things first and say, we've got to be faithfully, biblically, prayerfully God and Jesus grounded. And our politics should be an expression of that in the practical realm.
What does the church have to offer the world when it comes to peace and reconciliation?
Ooh, we have so much. Well, in the church, we learn, if you read your Bible, because I'm sure you're all reading your Bible, right? In Matthew, Jesus gives us some pretty clear, straightforward guidelines to handle peace and reconciliation. And I'm sure we've all committed these to memory. Okay, just in case anyone is new to this, I'll go through it. 1, when I'm having a bad day and I'm being really cranky, and I'm just really not very nice to Zeke, then I have to come back the next day and I go, Zeke, I need to apologize. I was really cranky the other day and I took it out on you. And Zeke, if he's feeling kind and charitable, he would say, he forgives me. I'd have to remember I don't get to do that again just because I'm feeling cranky. I can't just take it out on Zeke. But if I have an unfortunate moment, and I do, then I need to go to him alone and I have to apologize. And if I'm fortunate, he'll forgive me. Or if I come in the room and I find out that I see Kathleen and she sort of stiffens up when she sees me, I'm like, uh-oh. So I need to go, Kathleen, alone and say, I'm sensing there's something not right here. Can you tell me what's up? And she can tell me. Maybe she's just having a bad day. Maybe I told a joke at her expense and I shouldn't have. I thought I was being funny and she found it hurtful. And we work that out if we're fortunate, right? She'll forgive me. But then maybe I go to someone else and whatever I did, they're not feeling like forgiving me. Not today, not on that. So Matthew tells us, then you go and get somebody else. So I come in and get Shannon, and she comes with me, and we talk to them together, right? So the first thing is you do it alone. The first thing isn't like, I go to Shannon, can you believe Bob? I went and talked to him, and he wouldn't forgive me. He's so difficult. No, that's not what Jesus tells us to do. That's often what we do. That's not what Jesus tells us to do. So I go to Shannon, I get her, and we go together, and we try to persuade Bob, mythical Bob, to see if we can be reconciled. And if we can, it's a wonderful thing. And if we can't, Jesus tells them we should treat Bob like a publican and a sinner. And many people think that means, right? He's out of the club. He's a publican and a sinner, weeping and gnashing of teeth in the outer darkness. No, that is not what that means. How did Jesus treat publicans and sinners? As people to be won over, as people to be invited in, as people to be shown the love of God. So what it means is we need a do-over with Bob. That's what that means. So we have a model. And if we can learn together to walk through this scary, countercultural, Jesus-founded way of establishing peace and reconciliation among us, and then modeling it beyond us, we have an enormous gift we can offer the world. But it means we need to do it. That's the hard part. Are we all done? Woo! Thank you for your time.